I noticed I wasn't sitting with my family the moment I walked into the reunion hall. Instead of finding my name beside my son and granddaughter, I found a small folded card resting on the last table in the corner of the room, right beside the coffee station and the extra folding chairs no one expected to use. The card simply read, Margaret Collins. Nothing else. No family designation. No reserved place among the Collins relatives. Just my name, as though I were someone who had wandered in from the parking lot. I stood there for a few seconds, smiling politely while people continued chatting around me, pretending not to notice the strange arrangement. At 68, I had learned that dignity sometimes meant staying quiet long enough to understand what was really happening. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know which city you're listening from because I'd truly love to know how far this story has traveled. Family reunions had always been my favorite tradition. Ever since my late husband, Robert, was alive, we believed that once a year everyone deserved one weekend to slow down, eat together, tell old stories, and remember where they came from. Robert used to spend weeks planning games for the grandchildren while I baked enough pies to feed twice the number of guests we expected. Even after cancer took him 5 years earlier, I kept attending every reunion because I believed family traditions were bigger than grief. That Saturday morning, I had taken extra care getting ready. I wore a pale blue dress Robert always said matched my eyes, polished the pearl earrings he gave me on our 30th anniversary, and packed Emma's favorite homemade pecan cookies in a decorative tin. She had loved them ever since she was little enough to stand on a kitchen stool beside me. As I looked around the beautifully decorated lodge overlooking a quiet lake in northern Michigan, everything appeared exactly as I remembered. Children laughed outside on the lawn. Someone was grilling burgers. Country music floated softly through hidden speakers. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with barbecue smoke. It looked like the perfect family gathering. That illusion lasted less than a minute. "Oh, Margaret," my daughter-in-law Ashley called with a bright smile that somehow never reached her eyes. She walked toward me wearing an expensive cream-colored summer dress and wrapped one arm lightly around my shoulder. "There you are. We had to make a few seating adjustments. I hope you don't mind." Before I could answer, she gently turned me toward the small corner table. "You'll be much more comfortable over here." Comfortable. Such a harmless word. Yet somehow it landed heavier than an insult. I glanced toward the center of the room where Daniel sat laughing with cousins, uncles, and old family friends. Emma sat beside him, smiling as she helped decorate cupcakes with her younger cousins. There was an empty chair between Daniel and Ashley that would have fit me perfectly. Instead, it remained occupied by Ashley's designer handbag. "Ashley," one of her cousins asked while looking in my direction, "is she with your side or Daniel's side?" Ashley laughed softly before answering loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "Oh, she's just Daniel's elderly guest today. We thought she'd enjoy somewhere a little quieter." A few people chuckled politely. Others quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated by their paper plates or plastic cups. No one corrected her. No one said, "She's Daniel's mother." No one said, "She built this family long before any of us arrived." I looked at the empty chair beside my son one last time before walking calmly toward the corner table. Every step felt strangely light, almost peaceful. Sometimes the quietest moments reveal the loudest truths. As I placed my cookie tin on the table beside me, I realized something that would change the rest of my life. They hadn't forgotten where I belonged. They had simply decided I no longer belonged there. I sat alone for most of lunch, smiling whenever someone happened to glance in my direction, although very few people actually did. From my table, I had a clear view of the entire room. I watched cousins catching up after years apart, children running between picnic tables with paper plates full of watermelon slices, and old family friends sharing stories that grew a little more exaggerated every time they were told. The reunion looked exactly like the gatherings Robert and I had spent decades creating. The only difference was that somehow I had become a spectator instead of belonging inside the picture. Every few minutes someone walked past my table on the way to refill a drink or grab another cookie, offering the polite smile people reserve for strangers at community events. It was not cruel. In many ways, it was worse. They simply accepted where I had been placed. I opened the decorative tin and arranged the pecan cookies onto a small plate, hoping Emma would notice them. She always did. When she was 6 years old, she used to sneak into my kitchen before dinner and ask if one cookie could really ruin her appetite. I always pretended to think about it before handing her two. Those memories felt surprisingly close that afternoon, almost close enough to touch. I noticed Emma looking toward me several times, but each time Ashley called her over to help with something else. Once it was arranging family photographs. Another time it was greeting relatives who had just arrived. Every interruption looked perfectly ordinary. Taken one at a time, none of them meant anything. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. Daniel eventually walked over carrying a glass of iced tea. For a brief moment, I thought he might pull up a chair beside me. Instead, he remained standing. "Everything all right, Mom?" he asked with the careful tone people use when they already know the answer but hope he will make things easier. "Everything is lovely," I replied. "The weather could not be better." He nodded quickly, relieved that I had not asked the obvious question. "Ashley worked really hard putting this together," he said. "She has been stressed for weeks." I looked toward the center of the room where Ashley laughed as several relatives complimented the decorations. "She certainly planned every detail," I answered quietly. Daniel smiled without really hearing my words. "I knew you would understand." Then someone called his name from across the room, and he left before I could say anything else. I watched him disappear back into the crowd, wondering when conversations with my own son had become so short that silence filled more space than words. After lunch, everyone gathered for the traditional family photograph by the lake. Robert had started that tradition nearly 30 years earlier. Every reunion ended with the same picture, everyone standing shoulder to shoulder while the youngest children complained about smiling into the sun. I walked toward the group out of habit, but before I reached them, Ashley stepped gently into my path. Her smile never faded. "Margaret, would you mind waiting just a minute?" she asked. "We are doing immediate family first." The words settled over me more heavily than I expected. Immediate family. I looked at Daniel, expecting him to notice what had just happened. He adjusted Emma's collar for the photograph without lifting his eyes. No one questioned the arrangement. No one invited me forward. I stepped back onto the grass and folded my hands in front of me. The photographer counted to 3. Everyone smiled. Laughter echoed across the lake as another picture was taken. I stood just outside the frame, close enough to hear every cheerful voice, far enough away that I would not appear in the memory they were creating. It was then I finally understood that exclusion does not always arrive with raised voices or angry words. Sometimes it arrives with pleasant smiles, careful manners, and just enough distance to make you wonder whether the hurt exists only in your imagination. But deep inside, I already knew the truth. Nothing about that afternoon had happened by accident. I remained near the lake after the photographs were finished, watching the families slowly drift back toward the lodge for dessert and coffee. The afternoon sun reflected across the water in gentle waves, just as it had during dozens of reunions before this one. Robert used to stand beside me every year with one hand resting lightly on my shoulder, quietly pointing out how much the grandchildren had grown or laughing about how every uncle insisted he was still young enough to play baseball. Standing there alone, I realized that memories have a strange way of changing shape. They never disappear, but sometimes they reveal details we refused to see when they first happened. I thought back to the summer Daniel and Ashley bought their first house. They were so excited, but interest rates had climbed, and the down payment seemed impossible. Daniel had come to my kitchen one evening looking embarrassed. He kept stirring his coffee without taking a sip before finally admitting they were short by almost $20,000. I never hesitated. Robert and I had spent years putting money aside for retirement, but we agreed that helping our only son build a stable future mattered more than replacing an aging car or taking another vacation. We wrote the check the next morning. Ashley hugged me tightly that day. She called me the most generous mother anyone could ever hope for. She even cried while promising that our grandchildren would always know how much their grandmother had sacrificed for them. I believed every word because I wanted to believe we were building something together. A few years later, when Emma was born, both Daniel and Ashley were overwhelmed trying to balance work and parenthood. I drove almost 40 miles each way every Tuesday and Thursday to watch Emma while they worked late. I packed homemade meals, folded tiny clothes, read bedtime stories, and rocked her to sleep when she had ear infections or nightmares. Those days never felt like obligations. They felt like privileges. Watching my granddaughter learn to walk across my living room remains one of the happiest memories of my life. Ashley used to tell her friends that she could never have managed those early years without me. She introduced me as the heart of the family. Somewhere along the way, those words quietly disappeared. Then came the holidays. Every Thanksgiving dinner was at my house. Every Christmas morning began with cinnamon rolls baking before sunrise. Every Easter basket was filled by my hands after everyone else had gone to bed. I never kept score because love is not supposed to be measured like that. Families survive because people give without expecting a receipt. Yet standing beside that quiet lake, I found myself adding everything together for the very first time. Not because I wanted repayment, but because I was trying to understand when appreciation had slowly transformed into expectation. The more I remembered, the clearer the pattern became. Ashley gradually stopped asking whether I was available before volunteering me to babysit. Family vacations were planned before I heard about them. Birthdays were rescheduled without telling me until the last minute. Whenever I looked surprised, there was always a pleasant explanation. Everyone was busy. Plans changed. It was nothing personal. Each excuse sounded reasonable by itself. Together they formed a bridge leading directly to the corner table where I had spent this afternoon alone. I suddenly understood that today's reunion had not created the distance between us. It had simply exposed a distance that had been growing quietly for years while I kept convincing myself everything was fine. I looked through the lodge window and saw Daniel laughing with relatives while Ashley accepted compliments for organizing another successful family gathering. From where they stood, the reunion probably looked perfect. From where I stood, I could finally see the invisible line that separated being loved from merely being useful. Once that realization settled into my heart, something unexpected happened. I did not feel angry. I did not even feel like crying. Instead, I felt an unfamiliar calm, the kind that comes only after a difficult truth finally stops hiding behind hopeful memories. I walked back inside just as people began gathering around the dessert table. Someone had cut generous slices of apple pie, children were reaching for vanilla ice cream, and conversations blended into the familiar rhythm of family voices echoing through the lodge. I poured myself a small cup of coffee and moved toward one of the large windows overlooking the lake. For the first time all afternoon, I did not feel the need to force myself into conversations where my presence seemed optional. Quiet had become surprisingly comfortable. As I stood there, I heard Ashley's voice from the hallway leading toward the conference rooms. It was impossible to miss because she laughed before speaking, the same practiced laugh that always made people believe she was being charming instead of calculating. I had no intention of listening. I simply waited for my coffee to cool before stepping outside again. Then I heard my own name. Honestly, Ashley said with a soft chuckle, once Margaret finally stops coming to these reunions, everything will be so much easier. Another woman laughed politely. She seems sweet enough. Ashley sighed dramatically. Sweet, yes. But she always makes everyone feel guilty. Daniel never says anything because she is his mother, but the whole family walks on eggshells around her. I stood perfectly still. My hand tightened slightly around the warm coffee cup, not because I was angry, but because I suddenly realized I had never heard Ashley speak about me when she believed I was not in the room. Do not get me wrong, Ashley continued. She helped us years ago, and we appreciate that. But she acts like doing nice things decades ago gives her a permanent front row seat in our lives. People need to move on. There was a brief silence before another voice quietly asked, "Did she complain about sitting over there today?" Ashley laughed again. No. She never says anything. That almost makes it worse because everyone ends up feeling sorry for her. I looked down at my reflection in the coffee, watching the steam slowly disappear. The strange thing was that I could not remember asking anyone to feel sorry for me. I had never demanded attention. I had never reminded anyone about the money Robert and I gave them or the years I spent helping raise Emma. Most of those memories lived only inside my own heart. Yet somehow even my silence had become an inconvenience. I stepped away before they noticed me. There was nothing left to hear. The conversation did not expose a misunderstanding. It confirmed something far more painful. Ashley had carefully built a version of me that explained away every act of kindness as manipulation, every quiet moment as emotional pressure, every family tradition as an attempt to stay important. The realization settled over me with surprising clarity. People rarely wake up one morning and decide to treat someone differently. It usually happens one conversation at a time, one small comment after another, until the story becomes more believable than the person. I wandered onto the wooden deck behind the lodge where the evening breeze carried the scent of pine trees across the lake. The sky had begun turning shades of gold and lavender, and several children skipped rocks across the water while their parents watched from picnic benches. It was still a beautiful evening. Nothing about the landscape had changed. Only the way I understood my place within it had shifted. A few minutes later, Emma quietly opened the deck door and walked outside carrying one of my pecan cookies wrapped in a napkin. She looked around before approaching me. "Grandma," she said softly, "I could not find you earlier." I smiled and brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. "I was right here all along." She hesitated before asking, "Are you okay?" I looked into her kind eyes and saw none of the calculation I had just witnessed inside. She was still young enough to recognize honesty before loyalty became complicated. I smiled gently and answered with complete truth. "I think I finally am." The reunion ended just before sunset. Families hugged goodbye, children climbed sleepily into sport utility vehicles, and paper decorations fluttered gently in the evening breeze as volunteers folded tables and stacked empty chairs. I carried my cookie tin to my car, noticing that more than half the cookies were still inside. In previous years, I always drove home with an empty container because everyone insisted on taking a few for the road. This time no one had even asked. I placed the tin carefully on the passenger seat and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. The parking lot slowly emptied until only a handful of vehicles remained. Through the windshield I could still see Daniel helping carry coolers into the back of his truck while Ashley laughed with relatives as though the afternoon had been perfect. I realized something that surprised even me. I did not want an apology anymore. An apology could never return the years I had spent trying to earn a place that should have been mine from the beginning. It could never erase the careful conversations or the quiet exclusions that had slowly become normal. What I wanted was peace, and for the first time I understood that peace sometimes begins by walking away instead of waiting to be invited back. The drive home took almost 2 hours. The highway stretched ahead beneath a sky painted with fading shades of orange and deep blue. I turned off the radio and listened only to the steady sound of the tires rolling across the pavement. Robert used to say that long drives helped people hear their own thoughts more clearly. That evening, every mile seemed to peel away another layer of obligation I had carried for years. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the decision had already begun taking shape inside me, although I had not yet spoken it aloud. My house greeted me with familiar silence. I placed the untouched cookies on the kitchen counter, changed into comfortable clothes, and made a cup of chamomile tea. Robert's photograph still stood beside the window overlooking the backyard, exactly where it had remained since the week after his funeral. I sat across from his picture for several minutes. "I think I finally understand," I whispered softly. It felt strange speaking into an empty room, yet somehow I imagined he would have understood without needing further explanation. Robert had always believed that kindness should never require someone to surrender their self-respect. Somewhere after he was gone, I had forgotten that lesson. Early the next morning I woke before sunrise, made fresh coffee, and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Instead of checking family messages or social media, I searched for coastal towns where winters were mild, libraries were active, and walking paths overlooked the ocean. One place kept appearing again and again. Charleston, South Carolina. I spent nearly 3 hours reading about its quiet neighborhoods, historic streets lined with oak trees, weekend farmers markets, community art classes, and small cottages with welcoming front porches. The photographs showed people strolling along the waterfront carrying books, coffee, and flowers instead of rushing from one obligation to another. Something about those images settled gently into my heart. They did not promise a perfect life. They simply promised the possibility of a peaceful one. Around noon I called the airline. The representative answered with a cheerful voice and asked where I would like to travel. I took a slow breath before saying the words that would quietly divide my life into before and after. I would like to purchase a one-way ticket to Charleston. There was a brief pause while she searched available flights. "We have one leaving next Thursday morning," she said. "Would that work for you?" I looked around the kitchen where every cabinet, every photograph, and every familiar chair held decades of memories. Then I smiled, not because leaving would be easy, but because staying had finally become harder. "Yes," I answered calmly. "That will be perfect." As soon as the confirmation email appeared in my inbox, I did not feel fear or regret. I felt lighter than I had in years. Nobody had asked me to leave. Nobody even knew I was going. This was not an escape born from anger. It was the first decision I had made entirely for myself since the day Robert took his last breath, and somehow that single airline ticket felt less like the end of one chapter and more like the quiet beginning of another. The following Thursday arrived with the quiet certainty of a sunrise that did not ask anyone for permission. I woke before my alarm, opened the bedroom curtains, and watched the first light spread across the backyard where Robert had once spent every spring planting tomatoes and roses. For several minutes I simply stood there, holding a warm cup of coffee, letting the familiar view settle gently into my memory. I was not leaving because I hated this house. I was leaving because I no longer wanted every room to remind me of a version of myself that existed only to hold everyone else together. My suitcase waited beside the front door, neatly packed with clothes, family photographs, a few favorite books, and Robert's old leather journal. I had donated many things during the previous week, keeping only what truly mattered. The house looked lighter, almost as though it understood that some seasons are meant for letting go. I locked the front door one last time, placed the key inside the small envelope for my real estate agent, and drove toward the airport beneath a clear September sky. The flight was peaceful. I chose the window seat and watched the landscape slowly change beneath the clouds. The farms and forests of the Midwest gradually gave way to winding rivers, green marshes, and the sparkling coastline of South Carolina. For the first time in many years, nobody expected me to arrive with a casserole, organize a holiday dinner, solve an argument, or make everyone feel comfortable. My only responsibility was deciding where I wanted to have lunch after landing. That simple freedom felt almost unfamiliar. Charleston welcomed me with warm air carrying the scent of saltwater and magnolia blossoms. Palm trees lined the streets, and colorful historic homes stood quietly beneath enormous live oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Everything moved at a gentler pace than I had known for years. People smiled without appearing rushed. Cars stopped patiently for pedestrians. Even the breeze seemed unhurried as it drifted inland from the harbor. My small cottage sat on a peaceful street only a short walk from a neighborhood park. It had white shutters, a wide front porch with 2 rocking chairs, and blue hydrangeas blooming beside the front steps. The real estate agent handed me the keys with a cheerful smile before wishing me happiness in my new home. After she left, I stood alone in the empty living room listening to the quiet. It was not the lonely silence I had feared. It was the comforting silence of possibility. That afternoon I unpacked slowly, placing Robert's photograph on a bookshelf near the window where morning sunlight would reach it every day. I arranged my books, folded fresh towels into the bathroom cabinet, and filled the kitchen with groceries from a nearby market. Before sunset I walked to the waterfront, where people strolled along the promenade carrying ice cream cones, coffee cups, and leashes attached to happy dogs. An elderly couple waved as they passed. A young mother smiled while her little boy proudly showed me the seashell he had just found. No one knew my history. No one expected anything from me except a friendly greeting. It was strangely comforting to begin again without carrying old assumptions. On Saturday morning I visited the local farmers market. Fresh peaches, handmade soaps, flowers, and homemade bread filled colorful rows beneath white tents. A woman selling lavender plants asked whether I had recently moved into the neighborhood because she had never seen me before. When I admitted I was new, she introduced herself as Eleanor and insisted I join the community book club that met every other Wednesday at the public library. Before leaving, she wrote the meeting time on the back of a receipt and told me everyone was welcome, especially newcomers. I slipped the note into my purse and smiled all the way home. That evening I sat on my porch watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold while crickets began their quiet evening song. My telephone remained silent. No messages from Daniel. No calls from Ashley. No requests. No obligations. I expected the silence to hurt, but instead it wrapped around me like a gentle blanket after a long, exhausting day. For years I had believed that being needed was the same as being loved. Sitting there beneath the fading light with a cool breeze brushing across the porch, I finally understood the difference. Being loved allows you to breathe. Being needed never had. I settled into my new routine so naturally that the days no longer felt like something to survive. Every Wednesday afternoon I walked to the public library carrying a canvas tote filled with borrowed novels, and every Saturday morning I visited the farmer's market where Eleanor always insisted I sample whatever homemade jam a local vendor happened to be offering that week. My neighbors learned my name, not because I had done anything extraordinary, but because we greeted one another while watering flowers or collecting the mail. I planted rosemary and lavender beside the front porch, placed 2 comfortable rocking chairs beneath the shaded roof, and found myself smiling more often than I had in years. It was a quiet happiness, the kind that arrived without making promises. About 6 weeks after I moved, my telephone finally rang. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom," he said, sounding unusually hesitant. "We have been trying to reach you." I glanced at the peaceful street outside my window where a young couple pushed a stroller beneath the oak trees. "I know," I answered gently. "I needed some time." There was a pause before he cleared his throat. "Things have been busy." I almost smiled. Busy had become the family word for everything they preferred not to explain. Emma has soccer almost every evening. Ashley has work. We have been running everywhere. "I hope everyone is healthy," I replied. Another silence followed. Finally Daniel admitted, "Honestly, it has been harder than we expected." I listened without interrupting. "We never realized how much you used to help. There is nobody to watch Emma when schedules overlap. Holiday planning has become stressful. Even simple things keep slipping through the cracks." His words were not cruel. They were honest. Yet I noticed something important. He listed responsibilities before relationships. He talked about schedules before asking whether I was happy. Years ago, I would have immediately offered solutions. I would have searched for flights home, rearranged my calendar, and convinced myself that helping again might somehow restore what had been lost. Instead, I simply looked out at the flowering window boxes across the street and let him finish speaking. I hope things become easier, I said quietly. We are trying, he answered. Ashley has been under a lot of pressure. I wished him well before ending the call. There was no argument. No dramatic farewell. Only two people speaking from different lives that no longer fit together the way they once had. Later that afternoon, I met Eleanor for coffee at a small bakery overlooking the harbor. As we sat outside watching sailboats drift across the water, she noticed I seemed thoughtful. I told her only that I had spoken with my son after several weeks of silence. She stirred her tea before saying something I have never forgotten. Margaret, there is a difference between people missing you and people missing what you did for them. I repeated those words silently all evening. They were not bitter. They were simply true. During the following weeks, more messages began appearing. A cousin asked whether I would organize the Thanksgiving recipe exchange because nobody remembered all the details. Another relative wondered whether I still had the contact information for the reunion caterer since I had handled it years earlier. Someone else wanted the instructions for Robert's famous smoked turkey. Every message was polite. Every message appreciated something I had done. Yet almost none of them asked how I was adjusting to my new home or whether I had found friends or happiness. I answered each request kindly, but I no longer rushed to solve every problem. One evening Emma called instead of sending a text. Her voice brightened the moment I answered. She told me about school, her art class, and a science project she was excited to finish. Then she surprised me by asking, "Grandma, are you really happy there?" I looked toward the sunset glowing softly across the Charleston rooftops and answered without hesitation. "Yes, sweetheart. I truly am." She laughed quietly. "I could hear it in your voice before you even said it." After we ended the call, I sat on my porch listening to the evening breeze rustle through the oak trees. For the first time in a very long while, I realized that I was no longer waiting for my family to decide where I belonged. I already knew. Nearly a year passed before I heard the words I never expected. Autumn had returned to Charleston, bringing cooler mornings and golden light that filtered through the oak trees outside my cottage. My life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. I volunteered twice a week at the library, joined a watercolor painting class, and had become the kind of neighbor who exchanged homemade muffins and gardening tips over backyard fences. I no longer counted the days since I had left Michigan because time had stopped feeling like something I needed to measure. Then one Tuesday afternoon, while I was trimming lavender beside my front porch, a dark sport utility vehicle pulled slowly to the curb. I recognized it immediately. Daniel stepped out first. Ashley followed a few seconds later, smoothing the wrinkles from her sweater before looking toward my front door. They both seemed older than I remembered. Not because of gray hair or tired faces, but because life had finally placed weight on their shoulders that someone else could no longer quietly carry. I set my gardening gloves on the porch railing and walked toward them with a calm smile. "What a surprise," I said. Daniel returned the smile, although it faded almost as quickly as it appeared. "We hope we are not interrupting anything." "Not at all," I replied. I was only giving my lavender a little attention. I invited them inside. The cottage smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh coffee, and sunlight poured through the windows onto the wooden floors. Ashley slowly looked around the living room, her eyes lingering on the bookshelves, the framed watercolor paintings, and the fresh flowers resting in a simple glass vase. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. "It feels peaceful." "It is," I answered. We sat around the small kitchen table where I served coffee and slices of lemon loaf I had baked that morning. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Charleston. Emma's senior year of high school. It almost felt like we were strangers learning how to speak to one another without old expectations. Finally Daniel placed his coffee cup on the table and folded his hands together. "Mom," he began carefully, "we owe you an apology." I remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "After you left, everything changed. At first we thought we simply needed time to adjust. Then we realized how much of our family depended on you without ever acknowledging it. Holidays felt empty. Emma missed you terribly. I missed you." His voice grew softer. I should have spoken up that day at the reunion. I saw what happened. I convinced myself it was easier to stay quiet than create conflict. I was wrong. I looked at him for a long moment before nodding gently. Those words had taken courage, and I respected that. Ashley lowered her eyes before speaking. "There is something I need to say too." She took a slow breath. "I spent years believing I had to protect my place in the family. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing your kindness as competition instead of generosity. I told myself stories that made it easier to justify pushing you aside. Looking back now, I am ashamed of the way I treated you. Especially at the reunion." She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did not deserve that. I am truly sorry." The room became wonderfully quiet. No one rushed to fill the silence. I looked through the kitchen window where a pair of cardinals hopped between the flower beds, completely unaware that 3 lives were quietly changing inside the little cottage. I had imagined this conversation many times during my first months in Charleston. Back then I thought hearing those words would erase the hurt. Instead I discovered something unexpected. Their apology mattered, but it no longer held the power to determine my happiness. That work had already been done long before they arrived. I smiled warmly at both of them. "Thank you," I said. "I believe you mean every word." Relief softened Daniel's expression. Ashley quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Then Daniel asked the question I had known would eventually come. "Would you consider coming home?" I looked around the cottage that had become my sanctuary, then back at the 2 people sitting across from me. For the first time in many years, I did not feel pressured to answer quickly. I had already learned that the most important decisions deserved the quiet they required. I looked at Daniel for several quiet moments before answering. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Through the open kitchen window, I could hear birds singing in the oak trees while a gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water through the room. This little cottage had taught me something I had forgotten during the busiest years of my life. Peace does not arrive because other people finally understand your worth. It arrives when you stop asking them to decide it for you. I folded my hands around my warm coffee cup and smiled gently. "Daniel," I said, "I forgave both of you long before you knocked on my door today." Relief immediately crossed his face, and Ashley quietly closed her eyes for a moment as though a weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Then I continued. "But forgiveness and returning are not always the same decision." Neither of them interrupted. "For many years," I said softly, "I believed my purpose was making everyone else's life easier. I organized holidays. I watched Emma whenever you needed me. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, recipes, appointments, and traditions. I loved doing those things because I loved my family. Somewhere along the way, I slowly disappeared behind all of those responsibilities. I stopped asking myself what kind of life I wanted." Ashley looked down at the table while Daniel quietly nodded. "Leaving Michigan was never about punishing anyone," I continued. "I did not buy that one-way ticket because I wanted revenge. I bought it because I finally understood that staying where I was no longer welcome would slowly break something inside me. I chose to protect that part of myself before it disappeared completely." Tears filled Ashley's eyes as she whispered, "I understand now." I believed she did. Not because she cried, but because her voice carried none of the defensiveness I had heard so many times before. It carried humility instead. I reached across the table and gently rested my hand over hers. "People make mistakes," I said. "Sometimes those mistakes happen one small decision at a time until nobody remembers where they started. What matters is whether we are willing to recognize them before it is too late." Daniel smiled sadly. "Does that mean you will never come back?" I looked around the cottage one more time. Morning sunlight danced across the wooden floor. A watercolor painting from my first art class hung beside the bookshelf. Fresh lavender from my garden rested in a small glass jar on the windowsill. This house was no longer simply where I lived. It had quietly become my home. "I will come visit," I answered. "I would love to spend holidays with Emma. I would love to have dinner together and make new memories. But I am not moving back. My life is here now." Daniel lowered his head for a moment, before standing and walking around the table. He wrapped his arms around me with the same gentle kindness he had shown as a little boy whenever he needed comfort after a difficult day. "I am proud of you, Mom," he whispered. Those 4 words meant more than he probably realized. Ashley stood a moment later and hugged me as well. There were no dramatic promises. No impossible guarantees that everything would suddenly become perfect. Families rarely heal that way. Healing begins with honesty, grows through consistent respect, and survives only when everyone chooses it again and again. After they left that afternoon, I carried my coffee onto the front porch and settled into one of the rocking chairs. The street was peaceful. A neighbor waved while walking her golden retriever. Children laughed somewhere farther down the block. The sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, covering the neighborhood in warm golden light. I thought back to that afternoon at the reunion when I had stood beside a lonely table in the corner of a crowded room wondering whether I still belonged anywhere. At the time, I believed I had lost everything that mattered. Looking back now, I realized that difficult day had quietly given me the greatest gift of my life. It forced me to stop searching for a seat at someone else's table and begin building a life where I never had to question my place again. The one-way ticket had never been about leaving my family behind. It had been about finally finding my way back to myself, and that journey was worth every single mile.